There is a kind of silence that only exists underground. It's not the silence of an empty room, nor the silence of a forest at night. It's denser than that, a silence that isn't the absence of sound. It's the absence of the world. When you are meters below the surface, inside reinforced concrete, surrounded by steel and electronic systems humming at low frequencies, the world above simply ceases to exist. There is no wind. There is no sky. There is no horizon. There is only what is inside those walls, and what those walls were built to do. The Serpukhov 15 bunker was built for a single purpose: to detect the end of the world before it arrived. It was September 26, 1983. Shortly after midnight, Moscow time. The overnight shift was underway. The monitors glowed with that cold, greenish light that existed only in those installations. A light that didn't warm, didn't welcome, only informed. The operators did what they did every night: monitored, recorded, waited. It was a job that demanded a strange combination of absolute discipline and quiet resignation. You were there to watch for something that, if it ever truly happened, would mean everything was over. And most nights, mercifully, nothing happened. That night, the officer in charge was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov. 44 years old, an engineer by training, not a military strategist. A man who had built his career understanding systems, how they worked, where they could fail, what their numbers actually meant. He was not scheduled for that shift. The officer originally assigned had swapped with him for reasons history never recorded. A small administrative detail, the kind that happens in any workplace in the world. But on that particular night, that detail would matter in a way neither man could have imagined. To understand the weight of what was about to happen inside that bunker, you need to understand the world this man lived in. Not the world in the abstract, Cold Wars, superpowers, geopolitics. The concrete, visceral, psychological world of 1983. Because 1983 was not just another year of the Cold War. It was perhaps the most dangerous year since the Cuban Missile Crisis, 2 decades earlier. And in many ways, it was more frightening. Because in 1983, the two superpowers weren't merely armed. They were on edge, just 3.5 weeks before that night. The Soviet Union had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747, with 269 people on board, including a United States congressman. The Soviets claimed the aircraft was a spy mission. The world didn't believe them. Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, publicly called the Soviet Union the evil empire, a phrase that wasn't just political rhetoric, it was a declaration of moral posture. On the other side, the Soviet government was convinced, with a seriousness the West badly underestimated, that the Americans were planning a nuclear first strike. Soviet intelligence had launched a secret operation called Ryan, whose sole purpose was to detect signs that an American attack was being prepared. They looked for signals in everything: troop movements, patterns in blood supply purchases at American hospitals, lights on late at night in government buildings. The world, seen through Moscow's eyes in September 1983, was a place where the attack could come at any moment. And it was into that world, on that night, in that bunker, that Stanislav Petrov's monitors flickered. The alarm did not sound the way you imagine an alarm announcing the end of the world would sound. There was no explosion of noise, no immediate panic, none of the chaos the movies had trained people to expect. What happened was more unsettling than that. A light turned on. An indicator on the control panel changed color, and a number appeared on the screen. The number was 1. One intercontinental ballistic missile. According to the OKO system, the Soviet Satellite Early Warning Network, had been launched from American territory and was on a trajectory toward the Soviet Union. Petrov looked at the screen. Then he looked at his subordinates. None of them said anything. They were all looking at him. The protocol was absolutely clear. In the event of a detected nuclear attack, the officer in charge was required to report immediately up the chain of command. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a guideline open to interpretation. It was an order. And the logic behind it was the logic of the Cold War in its most brutal and direct form. If the other side has launched missiles, you have approximately 20 minutes before impact. 20 minutes to decide whether to retaliate or not. And if you wait to be certain, you probably won't be alive to be certain of anything. But Petrov didn't report. Not immediately. Because there was one thing on that screen that didn't make sense. Something small, technical, nearly invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years studying those systems and their limitations. And that thing was the number one: a single missile was not a nuclear attack strategy. It was a strategic contradiction. American military doctrine, just like Soviet doctrine, was built around the concept of the first strike. And a nuclear first strike only made sense if it was devastating enough to prevent any response. You don't launch one missile at a country with 10,000 nuclear warheads. You launch hundreds simultaneously, targeting military bases, command centers, and launch facilities all at once. So the enemy has neither the time nor the capability to retaliate. A single missile would destroy nothing that mattered strategically. It would alert the enemy, guarantee a massive retaliation, and result in the total annihilation of the country that launched it. It was, from a strategic standpoint, a pointless suicide. Petrov knew this. He had studied this. But the system said it was real, and here lies the central problem of that moment. The problem that transforms this story from a technical incident into something far deeper. Petrov was being forced to make an impossible decision with incomplete information, under maximum pressure, within a time frame that allowed no room for adequate reflection. The Soviet ground radar, which could have independently confirmed or disproved the satellite alert, could not detect missiles beyond the horizon. That meant any independent confirmation would arrive too late to be useful. By the time the ground radar picked up anything, the missiles would already be minutes from impact. The decision had to be made now, with what was available, which was a screen saying one missile and a human brain saying, "This doesn't make sense." And then the system updated. 2 missiles. The room grew quieter, if that was even possible. Petrov felt the weight of the update physically, not just intellectually. 2 was already different from 1. 2 suggested a pattern. 2 suggested intent. But it was still far too few for a first strike with any strategic coherence. He kept waiting. Kept thinking. His eyes moved between the screen and the faces of his subordinates, who said nothing, but whose bodies communicated everything. The stiffening of shoulders, the shorter breaths, the fingers that had stopped moving across keyboards. 3 missiles. 4. 5, with 5 missiles on the screen. The system was no longer indicating an anomaly. It was indicating an attack. The classification changed. The red letters on the panel read, "With the bureaucratic coldness of a machine that doesn't understand what it's announcing. Maximum confidence level." The system believed what it was showing, and the protocol was now not merely clear. It was urgent. But Petrov had a doubt he could not silence. The OCO system was new. It had been put into operation only a few years earlier, and from the beginning there had been internal questions about its reliability. Engineers and technicians close to the project knew that the satellites, under certain atmospheric and lighting conditions, could interpret the reflection of sunlight off high-altitude cloud formations as the thermal signature of a missile launch. It was a theoretically known flaw, never confirmed in the field, never formally documented in a way that would change operational protocols. It was the kind of problem military bureaucracies tend to bury because acknowledging it publicly would raise inconvenient political questions about the billions invested in the system. Petrov knew about this possibility, and it weighed against the 5 red points on the screen. there was also something else weighing on him. Something that wasn't in any manual, that no superior had taught, that existed only in the accumulated experience of years working with those systems. Legitimate alerts, the tests, the simulations, the real data the system processed during normal operation had a different quality to them. A consistency, a density of information that distinguished them from noise. And those 5 alerts, for a reason Petrov couldn't fully articulate but felt with the clarity of someone who had spent years learning the difference, didn't have that quality. They were technically perfect. They were formally correct. But something was wrong. Sometimes the most important knowledge a human being possesses cannot be translated into words. It exists only as a feeling, a certainty without argument. And it is precisely in those moments that the difference between a human and a machine becomes the difference between the world continuing or not. To fully understand what was happening inside that bunker in that moment, you need to understand something about how nuclear wars were planned during the Cold War. Something the governments on both sides rarely said out loud, but which was the foundation of all military strategy at the time. The theory of mutually assured destruction, known by the acronym MADI, which is not by accident the word for insane, was essentially this. Neither side would attack the other because both knew that an attack would guarantee their own destruction. It was a balance built not on trust, not on diplomacy, not on goodwill, but on fear. On the absolute and rational fear that any offensive move would result in mutual annihilation. It was peace as a product of terror. And it worked, insofar as the world still existed. But it worked with a dangerously thin margin of error. Because the entire system depended on each side, at any moment, under any circumstances, having perfect information about the other side's intentions. And perfect information, as Petrov knew very well, did not exist. By 1983, the global nuclear arsenal had reached its historical peak. More than 55,000 active warheads, distributed between the United States and the Soviet Union, with smaller quantities held by the United Kingdom, France, and China. To put that number into perspective, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in 1945, which killed between 90,000 and 146,000 people, which vaporized everything within a 2-kilometer radius of the impact point, which generated temperatures estimated to be equivalent to the surface of the sun, had a yield of 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. The warheads carried by American missiles in 1983 had an average yield of 350 kilotons, more than 20 times more powerful, and the Soviets had even larger warheads, some with yields of 20 megatons, which is 1,300,000 times more destructive than the most powerful conventional bomb ever built. 55,000 of those things, distributed across the world, pointed in predetermined directions, waiting for a signal. Petrov knew these numbers, not as academic abstractions, as operational reality. It was part of the context of everything he did in that bunker, every night, every time he looked at those screens. The scale of what could happen was not something he needed to stop and calculate. It was always there, like a constant background sound, a weight you learn to carry because the alternative is being unable to function. And now that weight had become concrete in a way it had never been before. What made Petrov's situation particularly agonizing was an asymmetry that few historical accounts of this event mention adequately. Petrov was not the finger on the trigger. He was the man before the finger on the trigger. His function was not to launch a counterstrike. It was to report the information to whoever would make that decision, which meant that if he reported the attack as real, the final call would be in the hands of other men, higher up the chain of command, who did not have his technical knowledge of the systems, who did not share his doubts about the reliability of the OCO, who were looking at the situation through a predominantly political and strategic lens rather than a technical one. Men who in 1983, in a context of maximum tension, with the memory of the downed Korean airliner still raw, with the paranoia of Operation Ryan running at full capacity, would have every psychological and political incentive to believe the attack was real. The Soviet protocol for responding to a nuclear first strike did not allow for prolonged deliberation. It called for an immediate response, because the logic of MAD demanded speed. If you waited too long to retaliate, your own missiles might be destroyed by the incoming attack before they could be launched. So the pressure to act quickly was enormous, and it was built into the very architecture of the Soviet defense system. Petrov was therefore in a position no human being should ever occupy. He was the only filter between a possible technical error and a nuclear war. If he functioned correctly, if he thought clearly, if he trusted his own judgment, if he had the courage to contradict a machine that insisted it was right, the world would continue. If he failed, if he yielded to the pressure of protocol, if he decided it wasn't his place to question what the screen was showing, the information would move up the chain of command and reach men who would almost certainly not question it either. And there was still a third possibility, the most disturbing of all. What if Petrov was wrong? What if the missiles were real, and he declared a false alarm, and the Soviet Union was destroyed without firing a single shot in response? In that case, he would not merely be the man who failed in his duty. He would be the man who, through overconfidence in his own intuition, through an excess of skepticism, had let his country die. That possibility was also there, also weighing on him, also real. There was no good option in that room. There were only two possible catastrophes, and Petrov had to choose which one was less likely. The minutes passed. The tension in the bunker had reached a level that those present would describe years later as physically palpable. The kind of tension you feel in the muscles of your neck, in your shoulders, in the way the air seems harder to breathe. Nobody spoke more than necessary. The systems kept running. The monitors kept blinking. The world outside kept existing without knowing that a man in an underground room was deciding whether it would continue to exist. And Petrov stood there, holding the phone, for a stretch of time that he would describe decades later, in rare interviews, as feeling far longer than it actually was. Stanislav Petrov picked up the phone and declared a false alarm. 5 red alerts. Maximum system confidence level. Protocol demanding immediate reporting. An entire chain of command waiting for his word. And he said, "It's not real. It's a system error. Do not report." And then he waited. This detail, the waiting after the decision, is what separates Petrov's story from any simple narrative of heroism. A movie hero makes the decision, and the camera cuts to the outcome. Petrov made the decision, and then sat in that bunker with those screens still blinking, knowing that if he was wrong, American nuclear missiles were at that very moment crossing the stratosphere toward Soviet cities. Knowing that every minute that passed without impact increased the probability that he was right, but that no individual minute was definitive proof of anything. Knowing that he had made a unilateral decision without consulting his superiors, directly contradicting established protocol, and that if he was wrong, he would be remembered not as a hero, but as the man who had let his country die out of arrogance. The minutes passed. The ground radar, when it finally reached the point where it could confirm or disprove the alert, detected nothing. No missiles, no trajectories, no attack. The silence of the world outside was, this time, the best possible news. The subsequent investigation confirmed what Petrov had intuited. The Oko system's satellites had captured the reflection of sunlight off high-altitude cloud layers, interpreting that optical signature as the propulsion flame of a ballistic missile. A technical failure. A calibration problem that the specific atmospheric conditions of that night had transformed into 5 consecutive false alerts, each logged at maximum confidence level. It was precisely the kind of failure that internal critics of the system had warned was possible. Precisely the kind of failure that military bureaucracy had preferred not to formally document. And precisely the kind of failure that would have gone undetected, and become catastrophic had the man sitting at that control post been someone who followed protocols without question. A. Nuclear war had been prevented, not through diplomacy, not through negotiation, not through wise political leaders making courageous decisions, by a middle-aged engineer who had swapped shifts by chance and who understood the limits of the technology the world had placed its trust in. And now comes the part of the story people tend to tell quickly, as though it were merely an ironic epilogue, but which is, in truth, the heart of everything. Petrov was not celebrated. He received no medal. He was not received by political leaders. His name was not announced in official statements. He was not given a promotion acknowledging what he had done. The Soviet government went silent about the incident for reasons that, when you think about them for a moment, make complete sense and are completely repugnant at the same time. If Petrov had acted correctly, then the OCO system had failed in a serious and potentially catastrophic way. And if the system had failed, the people responsible for approving it, funding it, and declaring it operationally reliable had an enormous problem on their hands. It was far more convenient for the incident not to exist, to be classified, to be buried in the secret archives of the Soviet state, away from any public or military scrutiny. What Petrov received was a reprimand, officially for improper filing of paperwork on the night in question, because throughout that entire crisis, while holding the weight of the world in his hands, he had filled out his operational records incorrectly. That is the level of bureaucratic absurdity with which the state he served treated the story of Stanislav Petrov. His career, which had once been promising, ended without ceremony. He was reassigned to a less sensitive administrative post, far from the systems he understood better than anyone. In 1984, he left military service. He found a job at the research institute that had developed the OCO system itself. An irony he never quite seemed to know how to process in the rare interviews he gave over the years. He retired when his wife was diagnosed with cancer to care for her. She died in 1997. In 1998, Petrov suffered a physical and mental breakdown, stating in interviews that he had been used as a scapegoat by a system that needed someone to absorb the embarrassment of its own failure. He spent the following years in a modest retirement in the town of Fryazevo, a few hours from Moscow. It was not absolute poverty, but it was a life of complete anonymity, a small apartment, no official recognition of any kind. The country he had, in all probability, saved from nuclear war had no institutional interest in acknowledging that fact. In 2004, 21 years after that night, a Californian organization called the Association of World Citizens gave him an award, a trophy, and $1,000. Petrov traveled to receive it. In the photographs from that ceremony, he looks like a man who isn't quite sure where he is or what he's doing there, slightly confused, slightly out of place, with the expression of someone who spent decades being invisible and suddenly finds himself in a room where people are standing up to applaud. He said, on that and other occasions, that he did not consider himself a hero, that he had done what he thought was right with the information he had, that any reasonable person with his knowledge would have done the same. Perhaps he believed that. Perhaps it was also the only psychologically bearable way to process what had happened, because the alternative, fully acknowledging that a single decision of his had preserved human civilization, is a weight very few human beings could carry with any sense of balance. Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017, in Fryazevo, of pneumonia. He was 77 years old. His death was not announced by any government. There was no official ceremony. A German journalist who had documented his story discovered the death months later, after calling Petrov's number and being told by a relative. That is how the world found out. There is a question this story leaves hanging in the air, and it has no easy answer. It is not a question specifically about Petrov. It is a question about the systems we build and the trust we place in them. About how many times during those decades of Cold War we stood at the edge of an end we never knew was coming. About how many other Petrovs existed. Men and women in obscure posts, with technical knowledge their superiors lacked, who made quiet decisions that never reached public knowledge because everything turned out fine. Or how many didn't, and we were simply lucky anyway. The story of Stanislav Petrov is not, at its core, the story of a hero. It is the story of a systemic failure that was contained by accident. By the accident that the right man was in the right place, on the right night, for reasons nobody planned. It is the story of how the world sometimes doesn't end, not because of great political decisions or historic treaties, but because of an anonymous engineer who understood the limits of his own technology better than the systems designed to protect it. The world does not know the name of Stanislav Petrov, but you do now, and that is something